Well, we're back, and we're talking about the dialogue praxis process. It's Marxism in its purest form, especially as aligned to the political warfare methodology that we're using. And we are going to do part 3, the dialogue praxis process, what the brief is named after. And we're also going to provide the vortex of visualization. And what this will do will give you kind of an additional visualization to give you a sense for how we're looking at this and how to understand how these processes work. And I hope that they kind of, some of them kind of might seem strange or a little bit off on the first time you see it, but what will happen is you'll start to see that it really does kind of capture a methodology that is actually easier to grasp visually than it is to read about, or that's my experience talking to people. And so with that, we will move into the dialogue praxis process. I think the first thing before going into any of these notes, what I'd really like to say is that the dialogue praxis process is extremely old. The reason I quote Acts of the Apostles on some of this stuff is, or the Roman Emperor Diocletian, is to say these practices, they're not new. And, when Hegel talks about his mystical approach, or Marx or Lenin accuse them of that, they do have a handle on what they're talking about that I think completely goes by the modern reader. It just goes right by them. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. I also like to point out that this process is the backbone of Marxism, and we're going to show that the early Marxists were emphatic about this. And in fact, the Frankfurt School is emphatic about it. And that is, I think the mainstream, if we're seeing a political warfare attack, it's basically using the Maoist insurgency model that's executing the original Marx that was brought back by the Frankfurt School. And, I know a lot of people want to get into some discussions on that. I would just challenge people to go to the original Frankfurt scholars, Lukács, all of them, Marcuse, and look just at the sheer volume of books, PhD theses that they wrote about Hegel. It's just incredible. So we're going to talk about the dialogue process. Hegelian metaphysic executes through a series of dialectical events that we're calling dialogue in a sustained period of process designated as praxis. I'm using the word dialogue because I think an awful lot of dialectical attacks start with the completely innocuous saying, we need to have a dialogue about this. And all of a sudden, you've given up what you believed, because there'll be a whole series of these dialogues, and the person who thought he was Sultan ends up being Pepper, or vice versa, and look back and say, well, how did that happen? So a dialogue is a dialectical event. So let's take a look at this and we'll see it. And that's the little green dot with something moving, is to kind of give the idea that the dialectic is in continuous motion, even as it's moving. Just as the planet rotates as it moves, so does the dialectic. And it's that kind of sense of movement and on a trajectory to a target, I think is always there. And to start off, I just want to quote a series of people to give the historical background on the concept of dialogue and praxis, to show that we're not trying to bootstrap a kind of an interesting idea that's actually peripheral to Marxism. So we'll go back to that original quote we've already given once from a book written on secret societies in the 1840s. We'll look at Marx, Leon Trotsky. We'll skip Masonic ties to the Russian Revolution, Lenin, Gramsci, Mao, and a man named Carnegie, an Austrian count. So dialogue and praxis from the esoteric to Marx. And we're going to this book that was written in 1884, Contemporary Socialism, by a man named Ray in London. And he's in the section on Karl Marx. He quotes from a book by a man named Marr, who wrote this book sometime in the 1840s when Marx was, standing up his views. called Secret Societies. And I really do think that this is a really important quote, because today we have a very separation of church and state view, not understanding that the dialectical attack attacked all aspects of culture, government and religion, civil and individual. And when your analysis, you may not, as a government analyst, want to go into how it attacked religions, but you ought to know that it did and that it does. And if that's out of your equation, it's like putting screen doors on a submarine and saying, because we're not going to look at it, the flood is not coming in. And then not allowing someone to close the flood doors, because then you'd have to recognize that it was coming in. So what does this quote say? The masses can only be gathered under the flag of negation. We're starting to understand negation is dialectical negation, and it was there from the beginning. When you present detailed plans, you excite controversies and sow division. We are content to lay down the foundation of the revolution. We shall have deserved well of it if we stir hatred and contempt against all existing institutions. If you are something today, the goal is to destroy you for tomorrow. We make war against all prevailing ideas of religion, of the state, of country, of patriotism. The idea of God is the keystone of a perverted civilization. It must be destroyed. The true root of liberty, of equality, of culture is atheism. Nothing must restrain the spontaneity of the human mind. And of course, quoting this book, Mr. Ray goes on and says, all of this work of annihilation could neither be done by reform nor by conspiracy, but only by revolution. A revolution is never made, it makes itself, with like a whole millions of dollars of investment in creating proletariats, of course. So then we could take a look at young Marx. You see, everybody likes to take a look at the picture of old Marx. But I think that Marx formed his main ideas when he was a young man. Everybody likes to quote old Hegel. But I think Hegel formed his ideas not when he was a professor, but when he was a seminary student. And there's overwhelming evidence for that. But more to the point, in contemporary scholarship, it's just completely ignored. So he wrote Thesis on Feuerbach in 1845. And in this, he basically talks about praxis. All social life is essentially practical. Comprehension of this practice, through practice. And I'll hold for a couple minutes, a couple seconds so people can read it. So the point is that Marx understood that Marxism, the ideas of Marxism, penetrated through a period of praxis. Here, I've shortened this. I had 5 quotes from Trotsky, but I narrowed it down to this one. The way in which my work on free, when Trotsky was in the Odessa prison, he taught what he called Masonic principles and Masonic tactics in a 1,000-page notebook. And he made it clear that at that time, I was still comparatively ignorant of the basic literature of Marxist. The work of Freemasonry acted as a test for these hypotheses. I made no new discoveries. All the methodological conclusions at which I had arrived had been made long ago and were being applied in practice. And in the writings of Marx, Engels, Plekhanov, and Mehring, I later found confirmation for what in prison seemed to me only a guess needing verification and theoretical justification. I did not absorb historical materialism at once, dogmatically. The direct method revealed itself to me for the first time, not as an abstract definition, but as a living spring, kind of like, isn't that what Wilson said? A living spring, Darwinian, as a living spring which I had found in the historical process, as a praxis which I tried to understand. While we're at it, what is the less obsession with the French Revolution, Spartacus, the Jacobins? Because historically we see this in Marxist magazines. There's the Jacobin right there, there's Spartacus, and clearly it relates to that. And in these Antifa, BLM street riots, we see people actually building guillotines. The one here is right in front of the White House. So, this imagery is very real and it's very connected. Marxists claim lineage from the French Revolution. excuse me. And here's Lenin talking about it, where he basically really gets upset for people who say, hey, some of these Christians, including Orthodox priests, are joining the movement. Should we just kind of line them up and shoot them? And he said, absolutely not. You're letting our doctrine get our ideology and our doctrine get in the way of actually moving forward. To preach atheism at such a moment and in such circumstances only be playing into the hands of the priest and the priest. A Marxist must be a materialist, an enemy of religion, but a dialectical materialist, one who treats the struggle against religion not as an abstract way, not just going after it blindly, not on the basis of remote, purely theoretical, never-varying preaching, but in a concrete way on the basis of class struggle which is going on in praxis, and is educating the masses more and better than anything else could do. If they're in your movement, just keep them in the movement, and over time, we will negate those religious views through a period of praxis. And here we have Antonio Gramsci, and there's the money quote that most people quote up there. Socialism is precisely the religion we must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society by infiltrating them in a period of praxis. Don't take my word for that, though. Don't take my word. The philosophy of praxis, that's what he called Marxism, by the way. The philosophy of praxis does not aim at the peaceful resolution of the existing contradictions. The contradiction is a binary, remember, in history and society, but is rather the very theory of contradictions. And he goes on to talk about his concept of domination. Then in the introduction to his book on Gramsci, it is pointed out explicitly. Thus, philosophy of praxis is both a euphemism for Marxism, especially when Gramsci was in jail, and an autonomous term used by Gramsci to define what he saw to be the central characteristic of the philosophy of Marxism, the inseparable link it establishes between theory and practice, thought and action. I took a picture of the table of contents to show that in the table of contents, the philosophy of praxis was about Marxism. So the Marxist Internet Archive raises this point. I'll give you a couple seconds to read that. You can stop and just kind of read it. And we'll move to Mao and his discussion on praxis. You see, this concept of praxis is very, very real. And it oftentimes gets translated as practice, and that's okay, except that, you know, sometimes you're missing the fact that that's the term that was really used. And so here we have it. I'll let you stop and read this, and then I'll make a couple comments. But there you see it. Praxis, 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 praxis. You think it was important to them? No, we'll build on this just a little bit. But I'd like to point out, if you haven't stopped it, stop it now to read it. That this is Mao quoting Lenin, analyzing Hegel on praxis. And then below, this is Mao quoting Marx on praxis. So again, there's just simply no gap in this analogy. More importantly, he wrote on practice and the earlier piece we used on contradiction within a month of each other. And he did it because the dogmatists in his party were getting carried away and he wanted to chew them out. He said, or as the commentary says, there used to be a number of comrades in our party who were dogmatists and who for a long period rejected the experience of the Chinese Revolution, denying that Marxism is not a dogma but a guide to action. The overawing people with words and phrases from Marxist works torn out of context. See, they want to be in this period of praxis. And then finally, I'm going to take a little turn to the strange, because this man, I don't really know, he was pro-Marxist, but he was kind of just a strange count from Austria. His name was Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi, who is considered one of the grandfathers and ideal centers of the European Union. And he came up with these weird ideas of inbreeding and bringing in non-European stock into Europe to breeding the European population out of existence, because as he saw it, he just hated the European people and wanted that to happen. And I just like to show that to you because as you see, the European Union literally forcing an inflow of immigrants and literally holding their own citizens responsible and blaming them when people push back on these immigrants who are basically held unaccountable. We see that these concepts somewhat have merged, and we see it today, the destruction of borders in America. So I don't want to think about it as disparaging anybody from any other country. I just point out that these people in Europe wanted their own people bred out of existence. And this is kind of something that just carries through. And of course, because we basically argue that there's a united front operation between the neo-Marxist left and political Islam, the Islamic movement, that the United States is the Muslim Brotherhood, I like to point out this quote to show that they too are involved in the period of praxis, although maybe they don't use that word. Akida is explained without telling what revolution it must bring in the life of an individual and the society in which he lives. Some rituals of religion and tradition of the Muslim community are explained. A short account of the Prophet's life is presented without the revolutionary aspect. When Islam is acceptable to the new entrants in this concocted and abbreviated form, the ceremony of Shahada is performed with great reverence. A non-Muslim becomes a Muslim obedient to Allah. The revolutionary aspect of Islam is rarely brought before the converts. They have their whole life to bring that forward to them. So you see, they're in this long haul. You know, one of the things that happens in these long hauls is they can keep calibrating up the event always just below your radar, where you don't see it if you're a government leader, where your people are actually clamoring and then you clamp down on the people for clamoring. This is simply an Islamic movement application of a series of dialectical events executed through a period of praxis that, as it turns out, seamlessly interfaces in the West with the Marxist line of effort as part of the United Front Alliance. They are aligned. And we're going to go back to that quote from Acts of the Apostles just to point out that in the Greek it was written in, the word practice is praxis. So we're on better and more solid ground than I think people might think. So here we have dialogue, a dialectical event, and here we have a expanded parentheses to open up the period that we'll call the period of praxis from start to beginning. Praxis is the process of negating a worldview over time through an ongoing series of dialectical events called dialogue. It's done through praxis, which is a period of process. So just think about this. When just dialoguing against competing views that are hostile and teleological, you may be participating in your own negation. And, you know, some people say they want a dialogue, and that's all it really is, just chatting. But you should always have your antennae up just to be making sure that's not happening. And I guarantee that a year after you have your antennae up, half the time you said that wasn't it, you'll go back and say, no, maybe it was. So converting a worldview to its opposite, one dialectical turn at a time, over time. So how does it work? Think of the bottom left-hand corner where you see that one dialectical event there as your worldview in the real world. Your worldview, standing up for America, your personal beliefs, and let's take that line in the middle, that arrow going across, and let's just say that's the break-even point. That is the having transitioned over to the other side. So this is always done without saying so, right? Just do it. Don't say it. Don't say political correctness is the enforcement mechanism to the postmodern narrative that implements Marxism. Just impose political correctness. Don't say, well, link up to Marxism and that's its goal. Don't say when it becomes more aggressive, it will transition to hate speech. Don't say hate speech will be the predicate for beating people up in the street like you see right now in Seattle, Minneapolis, and Portland, well, and New York City. It is operating in a direction over time, teleologically. It has a target. See that? That's how it works. Each one of those events happens, and sometimes they are logically before, one logically comes before the other, and sometimes one chronologically comes before the other, and sometimes both. So, and because they're always right below the waterline, you never have a clear target. Remember when we showed the triadic attack on the individual citizen from the three-pronged attack of the Hegelian metaphysic, the dialectic, science of reason, and the state is God, and it's all in cloud because they're in the fog of war, so they don't see the attack? That carries over to this as well. And we'll see in a different briefing how there's a process to make sure that they have a way to retreat if they overexpose themselves. So now we're going to, remember we talked about Aufheben, so we'll revisit this. Now we're going to revisit this point. Revisiting Aufheben, because now we have some pieces in place on what the period of praxis is. Excuse me. Aufheben is at the core of the dialectical event, an ongoing series of dialectical events in a period of praxis. And we showed that the law of non-contradiction violates the law of identity. And we had this point, and we're going to refocus on this point. And I know I'm hitting it the third time because we can't hit it enough, because this is a key understanding of how Marxism works when it turns the minds of your children in college. Okay, the Hegelian concept of Aufheben claims a mystical power to both make apples and not apples in the same operation. The nihilist understands the mathematical certitude of the one. If you take an apple and it collides with not apple, you don't have two apples, you have no apple, right? A negative collides with a positive, they're broken. But the ideologue thinks that the thesis converges with the synthesis, and that creates an uprising, better future with the antithesis, and creates the synthesis of something better than the two and moving forward. And this is what Schopenhauer was decrying. So let's create a visual, because we've already seen this period of praxis, and let's just stick with the apples and not apples. More apples or less? Does it really depend on how you look at it? Because here's what the nihilist knows on the right. Once an apple goes through the dialectical process, there's no apple. But the ideologue believes that there's two apples. So let's take that period of praxis, and each of these events is an axis of negation, and let's just show what happens when you put that apple through the period. The first axis, you see, the nihilist knows that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1/7 of the apple was taken, where the ideologue believes you have 1 1/7 apples. Now you have 1 2/7 apples, 1 3/7 apples. So as the apple goes through the period of praxis, the nihilist leader knows that all negation does is negate. It's a subtraction operation. It's actually first grade math. So the ideologues are correct. And the nihilists are correct, and the ideologues are just simply incorrect. And think about this. It's not logical, it's actually irrational. And it's irrational on a very large scale. So with that, we're going to transition to the visual vortex. And this is just taking that green dialectical thing and giving a different visualization on it to try to help you understand what's going on. So here we have a vortex from the side, the blue thing right here, to kind of explain what's going on there. Now we're going to look at it from the top. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the dialectical event from the top imposed on top of it. So what you see is at the center, let's just call that your thinking of your world. And the circle around it is just the way you see the world. It kind of informs you. It's your worldview, and it circles around your concept of yourself at the center, both personally, culturally, and within your religious community. And now let's just change that color to red to reflect the red pill, blue pill metaphor that we kind of keep here because it just helps people. So here we have this perceptual arc inside the circle of thought. And in that circle of thought, you have a worldview that values the West, values America, the Constitution, and the fact that America is based on a Judeo-Christian culture. something that has been stricken from our understanding of our own self is that what has been successfully almost completely destroyed is that we look on Judeo-Christian society and think in religious terms, refusing to understand that it is the culture that defines who we are, and it's the foundation on which the Constitution, America, and the West are built. And if you remove that from the equation, I'm not even getting into the religious side, I'm talking about the culture it instantiates, you have already maybe given up too much ground. So as this circles around, and the visualization will help if you think that your worldview kind of cycles at around 100 rounds per minute. And I'll explain why. Because these things operate kind of, there's movement in your thinking, just as it's moving around in the vortex. So by the way, I don't want you to overthink it either. It's just the conceptual arc of your thought inside the worldview you have. Well, then we think and we look at the a targeting worldview that is targeting you, the targeting worldview and the targeted worldview. So what we have here is that hostile conceptual arc. It also has a hostile conceptual arc, but it cycles itself purposely at 105 rounds per minute. That's its cyclic rate. Why? Because it was just 100, it couldn't overpower you. And if it was too fast, it would just bounce off of you. That cycle rate is calibrated to be able to penetrate in. So this hostile view wants to replace the West with globalism, wants to replace America with white supremacism, the Constitution with white privilege, and Judeo-Christian culture with dialectical materialism. So it will jump the curve and then capture the arc, your conceptual arc of how you see things as it cycles around. It does it at the same time, and it makes sure that it's going just a little faster so that it can overpower your worldview when it does so. It attacks into your worldview and it redirects your conceptual arc, first intercepting and then overpowering. What do I mean? You had your worldview that circles around right here, but it comes through right here and it's going just a little faster, overpowers this to bring it up. See, take your worldview and then swing it up. That's what is being done there, because it's going just a little faster. Now let's apply this to the dialogue, the Praxis dialogue process. And what do we see? Well, first I'd like to point out that going back to 1953, Bella Dodd pointed out in her quote, and I'll let you read it, that they did these things over a period of time, taking your words and then redefining them over time. This will become more real in a couple of minutes when we see that that's exactly one of the things they do. There are two phases of life that the communists take over. One is control over, and I drop the other. One is control over words and language. They are first taking over the nice words, all the nice language of the Christian world. They are taking them to themselves and giving them new connotation so that when they talk to the world, they are saying one thing. The language the initiate knows is what is being said, which is understood by the followers. But to our ears, it sounds like the things which we should be saying. And she said that at Fordham University in 1953. So here we have that narrative arc in the period of Praxis. So the bottom left, you have American identity. And as that hostile narrative arc comes in and overpowers, it will take your narrative, your conceptual arc, overpower it, and turn it into a negated American identity. So what does it do? It creates a series of binary terms or binary ideas. Term of lexicon identified, they identify terms for exploitation. Then they compromise those terms. For example, patriotism will be converted to racism. In religion, the Holy Spirit becomes the Geist, and then the Zeitgeist, and then the absolute act at the end of time. And I'm jumping over certain things. And then the term is either negated, repurposed, redefined, or replicated. So as I look at the bottom line reading this to you, see that's happening, over a period of time. You see those dialectical events right there. So you start off with a worldview with rights endowed by the Creator and individual rights But all of a sudden, America's turning to privileges granted by the state, which are group rights, but they're not really they're not really rights at all. Group rights exist, they're privileges, and they exist to destroy individual rights. Because individual rights are rights endowed by the Creator, whereas privileges are privileges granted by the state under the role of God. And what the state understands is you cannot worship God and mammon, so it will be mammon. I mean, I like that analogy. So constitution and patriotism becomes white privilege and white nationalism. Science, the biology of sex, becomes the pseudoscience of gender, okay? And science of understanding, real science, scientific method, becomes science of reason, pseudoscience, and demands authority for enforcement. So here we are, from a red pill POV, the Marxist strategy is simple and straightforward. Marxism is simply about isolating individual and cultural values, identifying their attributes, defining those attributes in negative terms, and then embedding them in narratives that can be imposed on society in a process that seeks their destruction, one negatively defined value at a time, over time. So here we have it, from science of reason, real science, which is a form of reason, to science of understanding, which is reason, and it moves. Its goal is to transition to science of reason, which is really a pseudoscience, and it seeks to instantiate authority as the basis for decision making, authority in the state, who will decide what science is. So pseudo-realities cannot tolerate unchecked scientific method. Pseudo-realities depend on sciences that they can control. But science you can control, of course, may not really be science. To accomplish this, the truth of reality is incrementally replaced by the fictions of a pseudo-reality, with as many pseudo-realities as it takes to completely negate the reality. And LGBT, race, economic status, anything they can define as a positive attribute of your world, they'll find a negative definition of it and impose it on you until you are intimidated into abandoning it. And that's the only thing it does. Regarding the matrix metaphor, the pseudo-reality is the blue pill world of the matrix, which is imposed by red pill players and red pill proxies, for example, Agent Smith, who are in charge of the matrix. Human pod slaves imposed by red pill leaders and enforced by red pill enforcers. Agent Smith. So let's wind down this part 3 and part 4 to kind of raise an issue, which is not going to be the main issue of this briefing, but it's out there and I want to lay down a marker. The interfaith demands of Big Tent. I can't tell you whether it's been a evangelical, Reform, Lutheran, Catholic church, or a synagogue. Every time they become a big tent, the people who allow the big tent to come in within a couple of years talk about them being a remnant, okay? Because the big tent is allowed because you had a dialogue, and the dialogue was a period of praxis to negate your worldview. So interfaith demands the big tent, which is often a dialogue-driven narrative. And I'm using it here in non-religious terms, the language of America, replaced by the language of the new worldview. So why am I using this interfaith example? Well, because the interfaith movement has always served as a major point of penetration for Marxists. You know, the biggest interfaith organization and one of the oldest in America is Industrial Areas Foundation, founded by Saul Alinsky in 1940, the author of Rules for Radicals. It is the organization that controls the interfaith activities in the Washington, D.C. area and in other metropolitan areas. And I think you should know that. Later, the interfaith movement became a major point of penetration for the Islamic movement. They had so much success, they're writing books on how to do it. This is from the IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought. And it remains a major point of penetration for both Marxism and the Islamic movement as part of a united front effort. And yet, they'll impose separation of church and state while they subvert American citizens by being under the veil of the interfaith movement. And in fact, there's quite a bit of evidence for this that is simply as easy as, going on the internet and showing the forums that have been held to do this. So there's no real mystery here. And with that, what we will do is we will end this brief. The next part will be about the narrative build, the narrative build of the dialogue praxis overlay. And in many respects, this is the most important part. We gave the examples of how we really started the brief at the end, explaining how the insurgency pyramid interfaces perfectly with the political warfare methodology. We showed how the critical racial theory intersectionality is pure, undiluted Marxism. But really what we want to show is these concepts of Marxism that we've built up this model for exist to create narratives, because Marxism operates on command narratives, command and control narratives. They send narratives on an arc that they expect people to obey. When enough people obey, when enough of the masses obey, you have a mass line. And when they give their command and control narrative and they have performance, it's no longer a mob because it's directional. And this next series of presentations will focus on that. And with that, I thank you for listening, and we will be back.